has become Wisconsin's leading advocacy group for immigrant rights, educational access, and workers' rights, and recently organized a demonstration of tens of thousands at our state capitol. She has served Voces in different capacities, including newspaper editor and board member. Rachel is also a founding member of Jewish Voice for Peace. And next, we have Ed Falone, who is currently Associate Professor of Law at Marquette University Law School. His primary areas of teaching and scholarship include constitutional law, corporate law, immigration law, and white-collar crime. He's also practiced law as counsel and associate at 2 Milwaukee law firms. Professor Falone currently serves on the board of directors of Voces de la Frontera. His past community service includes the Wisconsin Hispanic Lawyers Association, president and board member of Latino Community Center, president of Centro Legal por los Derechos Humanos, chair of the Catholic Charities Immigration Counseling Project, and member of the Board of Trustees of Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. In 2013, Ed ran as a candidate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court, seeking to become the first Latino to serve as a justice on our state's highest court. The election was won by Patience Rogensack, but Ed received over 360,000 votes. And finally, Luis Kenkar is Associate Professor of Sociology at Marquette University and directs its interdisciplinary Major in Peace Studies program. Professor Kenkar has published widely in the field of Arab American studies and on the impact of economic sanctions on women and children in Iraq and the forced migration of Palestinians and Jordanians from Kuwait. Her 2009 book, Homeland Insecurity, the Arab American and Muslim American Experience After 9/11, was honored by the Arab American National Museum. Luis also serves as the president of Arab American Studies Association in Milwaukee and as the treasurer of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. She was the founding director of the Palestine Human Rights Information Center in Chicago and has won numerous awards for groups there, including for outstanding contributions to the city of Chicago presented by Mayor Daley. At this time, I'd like to turn everything over to Mark, who will be the moderator of our meeting.
First, why don't we give a warm welcome to our panelists. Folks, again, thank you for taking part in this. I don't think we're going to need the mic, but if anyone has a problem hearing, just ask and we can turn them on. Our first question that we're going to ask you today, we're going to give you each about 5 minutes if you need it to respond to this, and then we're going to give you about 5 minutes to have a little back and forth. Is just starting out with who are these refugees and what are they going through? Let's try to understand the suffering that's taking place here a little bit. And particularly, we're wondering what role, if any, does race, gender, and class play, and who suffers and who does not? What are some of the realities of that suffering the average U.S. citizen or politician might not appreciate? And also, who, if anyone, is benefiting from the current situation? And I guess anybody can start.
Okay, sure. So I was charged with the Middle East, which is a very, very, very large area, depending on how you define it, because you know that's a made-up term, right? There's no such place as the Middle East. So more than 30 countries. The Middle East is not only the top source of refugees, it's the top host of refugees. And this is something that's just not ever discussed. I mean, those countries are host to more than 30 million refugees, right? They themselves are taking on the majority of the refugee burden, not the West. The West has a trickle of these refugees. The main source countries, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Somalia, and Palestine. And again, these are all kind of complex situations. The ones we hear about mostly are from Syria and Iraq right now. when you, excuse me, when you asked about whether certain groups are most affected from this group of refugees, I mean, of course, children are, right? Because more than 50% of refugees are children. Their futures are lost. They're not in school in most of these places. So there's a whole generation of what they call in their reports human capital being lost. Women are very vulnerable as refugees. In all of these countries, except Syria and Iraq, excuse me, the refugees are spread across religious groups and genders, and there is no concept of race in the Middle East, so people from the Middle East learn race in Europe and North America. That's where they learn the meaning of race and racism. We can talk about that later, because they're not very welcomed in either of these places. But the Iraqi refugees are unique in that it is mainly Sunni Muslims who are fleeing because, and there's a Christian component here, but that's that's been over 100 years, Syrians and Chaldeans leaving Iraq, and that's related back to the British colonial days, how that got started. But the Sunnis are fleeing because when the U.S. invaded Iraq and then destroyed it and then occupied it, they proceeded to de-Ba'athify it, and pretty much the Ba'ath Party was largely Sunni Muslim, so pretty much a large proportion of the Sunni population lost their jobs, right? Through de-Ba'athification, and also through free market capitalism. So Iraq, and I had been there, was a very wealthy country. They had oil. There was somewhat of a socialist government, right? People were employed by the government in many what are here private sector jobs. Well, the free market capitalism took away the state, destroyed these industries, and again, massive unemployment. And then the U.S. administration there kind of took what I consider an American model of racial and ethnic politics and decided that they would create a Sunni political party and a Shia political party. And that they would favor the Shia political party because the Sunnis were somehow attached to Saddam Hussein. And the result has been disastrous for Iraq and for Sunni Muslims in Iraq. So this kind of Sunnis and Shia married in Iraq, they were neighbors in Iraq. I mean, there wasn't this kind of divide in Iraq prior to the American administration there. So in Iraq in particular, Sunni Muslims are fleeing. And everybody is fleeing ISIS in Syria, everybody. I mean, Christian, Muslim, Sunni, Shia, Yazidi, Druze, and they're fleeing everybody's fleeing the situation in Syria, which is a disaster right now. So that probably went over my time, but
that's okay. Maybe if you could just say a word too about in the rest of the world, why are we seeing who are we seeing so much from all these other areas? Why is all that going on as well?
From which area?
I mean, when we talk about Africa and Southeast Asia and so forth.
I cannot speak to Southeast Asia,
okay.
So it's not my
area
of expertise.
And we're going to get more.
And Africa, I just I just came from Sicily, which I think I went to a conference on refugees in Sicily, and I met with some organizations there. The African refugees from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, which I cannot discuss, I don't know much about them, are fleeing to Italy. And we don't hear about that very much. We hear about Greece because they're going up to Germany and wherever. But the Italians seem to be managing this process quite well from what I discovered when I was in Italy. They have different communes, as they call them in Italy, that are hosting refugees. The church and non-governmental organizations are getting them involved in Italian language classes and finding them jobs and hosting them. So I did not hear any complaints in Italy about refugees. And then they said the ones that are really trying to meet family who are up in more northern Europe move on, but a lot of them stay. That's what I can say about that.
And as far as class, I mean, when you're talking about Iraq, is it people of all classes?
Yes, I think it's people of all classes. I mean, what I know about Iraq is that right after the U.S. just prior to and right after the U.S. invasion. The wealthiest in Iraq, well, no, they were poor too, because I was living in Jordan then. The wealthiest in Iraq could get citizenship in Jordan. You know, it's like wealth anywhere. You're able to buy privilege. So you had poor Iraqis living in downtown Amman and selling cigarettes on the street, and then you had wealthy Iraqis building villas in Amman, right? The poor have gone back to Iraq, and the wealthy are staying in Jordan. So you have that. Syria, though, I think it's all social classes. I don't think there's any distinction there.
Thanks, Louise. Rachel?
Okay, well, thank you so much for having us and for coming out on a gray March morning. I also want to say that for Jewish people, it's the Passover season, and that's a time when we think a lot about Exodus and crossing to liberation. And I know that the theme is mercy, and I think that that's really important. But I also really tend to think about welcoming the stranger, which is mentioned 36 times in the Old Testament, as self-interested, because I think we all have been and will be and could be strangers. So I think it's just common sense, and I often speak about that to audiences. I don't think it's necessarily charitable. If you take I'm a historian, so in the long range, it's just do unto others, right? I also want to say I'm teaching a refugee studies class now, and I'm an immigration historian, so this is a little bit new for me, just because of how academic categories work. And I want to push back a little bit against a way that we tend to frame things as migrants or refugees. Because who gets considered a refugee is a very political, very charged question, and many people who wish to be refugees are considered migrants only because of certain entrance questions or certain decisions of certain securitization forces. And so I think thinking about these things together, particularly because we're talking about really, we're talking about Central America and the Middle East, and those are at the face of it very different situations, but I think that they're connected in many ways. So in terms of who's a refugee, I guess I want to talk a little bit about Western Hemisphere, mostly about Western Hemisphere issues, and I've been thinking a lot about the murdered Honduran indigenous activist Berta Cáceres of late. She was murdered 3 weeks ago. She was an indigenous activist, and this points us to thinking about who is suffering in a very direct way, because very often in Mexico and Central America, it's indigenous lifestyles that are under siege by, and here's who's profiting and benefiting by this, by international resource extraction companies. So in Berta Cáceres' case, she was involved in COPEN, an indigenous rights organization that was really trying to preserve indigenous ways of life, which are very simple, subsistence agriculture, which were under siege by a dam project in Honduras. The dam was to build, to furnish hydroelectric power to a mine. And the indigenous people opposed the dam. They went through the courts in Honduras and said, this is a violation of our rights. It's a violation. Indigenous people in Honduras don't have the same status as Native Americans do in terms of sovereignty, but it's a violation of our rights. And our local councils control, this land and these rivers. And they're actually acknowledged, but then it was overturned by the new government that came to power with U.S. support in 2009, which really supported mining as a growth-intensive activity for the country, which, well, it grows the country for some people and not others, right? So there's a class and a race component there, because really this dam would mean the eradication of the indigenous ways of life of Cáceres' people. And her murder 3 weeks ago, and the murder the next week of one of her colleagues, indicates just how pitched this battle is over resources. So that's a frame to understand why Central American mothers, I'm a Jewish mother, okay, I would not send my kids to walk over several countries for refuge unless things were extremely bad. Like, I don't send them out to buy milk by themselves if it's getting dark, right, in Milwaukee. I'm not going to send them to cross several borders alone unless I'm quite desperate. And I don't think Jewish mothers are really, despite the folklore, any different than any other mothers. Right? We don't want our children out alone. We don't want them out after hours. So that you're doing this, that a regime is murdering its own people, tells us that there's extreme danger. And that these people, Hondurans and Central Americans are a really great example, because the mass media discourse was about refugees, but we did not welcome them. You know, at best we detained them and mostly we sent them back. So that's a really good example, and I'll stop because I think I'm over my time. That's a really good example of people who wanted to be refugees. I mean, rule of thumb, you send your kids to cross a border alone, there's a reason for it, right? That, you know, well-founded fear is the language in our law. That's a well-founded fear, right? You know, but we're not treating them as refugees. I just want to say one thing about the Middle East. I'm not the scholar of the area that Louise is, but I've become more informed about it as my political work has drawn me into it. One thing that is not talked about the Syrian refugee crisis is the only way to get out of occupied Gaza is by boat. And so we don't talk about the Syrian refugees as containing a lot of refugees from Palestine who are, you know, the Israeli government counts the calories per day per person in Gaza. That's the level of occupation there. So yeah, that's what's led into the area in terms of, so that's something we don't think about too in terms of human rights.
Thank you.
Good morning. Happy to be here with you today. I think just at the outset, let me say that it's very important for people of faith to be involved and to be active in these issues. And I'm very thankful for the faith community for being on the side of human rights and immigrant rights. You know, the question is, you know, who are these refugees around the world? And of course, no one is born with a label on their head that says refugee. And no one is born with a label on their head that says illegal immigrant. How do these labels get affixed to people? Right? We affix them to people. It's our decision. It's our creation. So I'm coming at this from a legal perspective. Right? The word refugee has legal meaning. We decide who is a refugee. And when you talk about undocumented individuals in our country, right, the word illegal immigrant refers to a legal category. And in both cases, we create these categories, and by leaving people outside of lawful admission, by leaving people outside of the category of those allowed to come in, we create those who are not allowed to come in. So, for example, the word refugee. Right now we have a refugee crisis caused by people fleeing Syria and Iraq, and they are crossing borders into Europe, and they are destabilizing forces. They move across borders to try and save their own lives. The question is, can they be resettled? We have a legal system for the resettlement of people who are displaced. And that legal system depends on those people qualifying as refugees. Now, there's probably three categories of people who flee their home country. Now, the first category is an activist, and that is someone who is trying to affect social change in their own country, like in Honduras, you know, trying to be a leader, affect social change, and by taking action, putting themselves out there as an activist, they perhaps put their life at risk. Those people would clearly qualify under our legal definition of refugee. If they were to flee because they had a death threat against them and they came to the United States, we would say you are entitled to stay here because you have a well-founded fear of persecution. That's one of the categories on the basis of your political activity. So that would be a way in which an activist, someone who takes the initiative, puts themselves out there, satisfies our legal idea of refugee. There are lots of other people who flee for their lives, not because they put themselves out there, but because they're born with a characteristic. They have a religious belief, or they're a member of an ethnic minority, or they're an indigenous person. And because of that characteristic they're born with, they become a target. They're not an activist, they're not trying to say change the world, but they happen to live in a culture where their characteristic makes them a target of persecution or discrimination. If those people were to flee for their life and come to the United States, they would probably qualify for refugee status under US law, because someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their religion, on the basis of their ethnic group, on the basis of their race, and even it's become established in the US on the basis of your sexual orientation, you can qualify as a refugee. So activists qualify, and people who are targets qualify. But the vast number of people who flee for their lives are neither activists nor targets. They are simply victims. They are simply people who are fleeing war, or they are fleeing random violence in a city where the drug lords have taken over, or they are fleeing natural disaster where there is no way they can survive because there's no way of feeding themselves or their family because of natural disaster. They're simply victims. And when they flee for their life and try to go to another country because of victim status, they don't qualify as the legal definition of refugee. And that is a big problem. And they are simply admitted or replaced and resettled on the grace of other nations. And so when you have a vast movement of people, the charity tends to run out. Now that's the sort of the Middle East Syrian situation. In the US, we have another situation, another legal label, another category, right? People say illegal immigrants, right? Well, in the United States, to come lawfully and enter the US, you can come in lawfully if you satisfy that refugee definition. You can come in lawfully if you have a close family member in the US who files a petition to bring you over. And you can come in lawfully if you have education and job skills, and there's an employer in the US who wants to hire you. And there's a few other categories. People, members of religious denominations can come in. There's some other categories, but those are the three main. What's missing? A legal way to come into the US if you are an unskilled worker. You simply want to work hard, but you don't have the education. You don't have the job experience. You don't have a family member in the US, and you don't qualify as a refugee, one of those targets or activists. You just want to work with your hands, unskilled labor. There is no legal way to emigrate to the US to do unskilled labor. And yet there's a huge demand in the US. Employers want to hire these people. And so you have Mexicans and Central Americans who want to come to the US. They want a better life for themselves and for their family, but there's no legal avenue. We expect them to simply say, well, that's it, fine, I won't do it. But of course they come in anyway. And that's simply because we have decided not to create that legal avenue. We could, if we wanted to, create visas, tens of thousands. We could create 50,000 visas a year for unskilled labor, and then let some of that labor come into the US if we wanted to. And that's part of what immigration reform is about. Changing our immigration laws to create this legal way for this category of people to come in, and simply by doing that, they're no longer illegal immigrants. They become lawful, just like that.
Thanks. You started to talk there toward the end a little bit about what I think we have sometimes been termed economic refugees, right? And I don't know if anyone else wants to talk a little bit more about that piece of it, but let's just take a few minutes. If there's anything you didn't get a chance to say earlier, or something you want to say in response to something you heard someone else say, Rachel?
I guess I have two things. One, to push back a little, Ed, I think you talked about the ideal categories of the refugees, but because the United States is so allied with the regime in Honduras, Berta Cáceres, who received multiple death threats before she was murdered, would not have qualified as a refugee. So, I mean, and this was true, my specialty is the Cold War. If you were a political dissident in the Soviet Union, you could get asylum. If you were a political dissident in, say, fascist Greece or fascist Portugal, it was harder. And the other piece is, something I didn't say is that many of the people you're talking about have been, people from Central America and Mexico have been displaced by NAFTA. So they're economic refugees in a way, but then NAFTA is a political alliance. So this is really complicated, right? NAFTA has resulted in the destruction of small farming in huge parts of Mexico. So many people who were self-sufficient small farmers now find themselves migrants. But you could call them economic refugees, and in a way you could call them political refugees because who decided about NAFTA?
I just want to say, I think it's apparent, but I want to say it, that the so-called Syrian refugee crisis started in 2011. It only became a crisis when it hit Europe, crisis here. But there have been 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan since 2011. And those countries, which are not wealthy countries, have been hosting these refugees. I made a little handout here that shows how many are in each country. I mean, these are countries that themselves are trying to stay together, and yet they are able to be kind and host each one of those countries more than 1 million refugees and not be selfish about it. But as soon as they hit Western Europe, oh my God, now it's a crisis. So what is the source of the crisis, really? What is it? Is it that people who are brown or Muslim are now want to live in Europe? Is that really the crisis? Because if it's about refugees, then that crisis has been going on for quite a long time.
And I would agree that it's one thing to talk about our system of handling people who want to cross the border and maybe trying to design a better system. But there's a whole other question of politics and how that system is administered. And it's very true. You know, in the 1990s, or in the 1980s in particular, I guess, under President Reagan, I was representing political asylum clients, people who were claiming to be targets of persecution. And very similar claims coming from Nicaragua, where we were opposed to the government. The approval rate of those claims was very high, 70%. Coming from El Salvador, where we supported the government, so the idea that people would be fleeing from our friend, the approval rate, very similar claims, was 3%. 3% approval rate. I mean, you see an approval rate like that, you know, well, it's not really the merit. There's a political component. Mm-hmm. And then also in terms of, when do we pay attention to these displacements of people? And I think Louise is right. I mean, we pay attention to it when it's in our political interest to pay attention. And when it's not in our interest, we ignore it.
Thank you. Well, that's a good segue into our second question, which really gets to the heart of this question for us. What, in your opinion, are the top drivers of migration from Latin America? We've kind of talked about that already a bit. You may want to say more about that. Either into the U.S. or refugees from the Middle East and elsewhere into Europe or other places. Why would you argue that these are the most critical factors? And I guess what I'm, and I think members of the committee are most interested in knowing is, what, if any, responsibility, and you've begun to touch on this a little bit already too, does the United States play for any of these factors? And do you feel that our leaders and news media give enough attention to those factors? And if not, why? What do you see them pushing or implying as the reason? And, Ed, why don't we start with you this time?
Well, again, I'm going to give two different answers, one for the Syrian-Iraqi situation and one for the Mexican Central American situation. I'm old enough, barely old enough, I'm old enough to remember the end of the Vietnam War. And when South Vietnam fell, the huge numbers of what were called the boat people, right? People fleeing South Vietnam because they didn't want to live under communist rule, getting onto boats, going out into the South China Seas, oftentimes with really no hope of survival unless they got picked up by a military or commercial vessel. And the United States government accepted responsibility for that mass movement of people, because the United States government accepted that it was our intervention into Vietnam and then abandonment of South Vietnam that created the situation where this humanitarian crisis was existing. And so Congress and the president at the time created a way to bring in a very large number of Vietnamese refugees who were resettled in the U.S. because we felt we had a moral obligation. Today I look at the debate over the refugee crisis out of Syria and Iraq, and I see no discussion in Congress or the White House or in the media about our responsibility following the invasion of Iraq, the destabilization of that whole part of the world, trying to effectuate regime change in Syria. What's our responsibility for creating that destabilization in their internal political structure that then has led to this crisis? There's no discussion. So I draw a very huge contrast between our acceptance of moral responsibility for our geopolitical actions after Vietnam versus our apparent refusal to even think about that today. And then in the Central American and Mexican situation, I think Rachel mentioned NAFTA as a driver. When the price of corn in Mexico collapsed after NAFTA was passed because U.S. corn producers were flooding Mexico with corn. And so Mexicans who had survived on basically small plots of land growing corn could no longer survive that way because the price of corn collapsed because they're competing against these huge agri-farms in Nebraska. And so these people had two choices, right? You can't feed your family growing corn. You either move to Mexico City or one of the cities where there really was no economic opportunity. You live on the street, or you try to immigrate to the U.S. So that's a big part of the consequence. But there was another consequence, another thing we did, which was very counterproductive. We've historically, ever since ever, we've historically had an ebb and flow of Mexican migration into the U.S. Mexicans would work for a time in the U.S., save some money. Usually it would be that male head of household. Then they would return back to Mexico, where the family was, the wife, the children. With that cash they've saved, they would stay in Mexico for a few years. Then they might migrate back to the U.S., do it again. Maybe as their male child got older, the male child would accompany the father into the U.S. And you saw these patterns of migration across the border. And if things got bad in the U.S., the economy was bad, there wasn't opportunities, then they wouldn't come, or they would leave and go back to Mexico for a while. In the 1990s, we took a series of steps to make it much more difficult for people to migrate across the border without a visa. Greater security, so that the border crossing would have to take place at higher risk out in the desert, become much more dangerous. Also, coyotes, the people who smuggled, because of the greater risk, they raised their fees substantially, over $10,000 a person per crossing, right? Which means that once you cross, you're trying to pay back that coyote, so you got to stay in the U.S. till you raise that $10,000. Plus, it's so dangerous to cross. You're thinking, I should just not go back. I should stay here because it's too dangerous to keep going back. And then you think, well, then what I need to do is stay here and make money, and then I have to bring my wife and kids over because I can no longer go back and visit them there. I have to bring them in here. And so what we've done with the fence, the virtual and real fence, it doesn't just keep people out, it keeps people in. And that prevents that safety valve of people leaving and going back. They stay. And so why did the undocumented population go up and up and up to the point of 12 million? Because it used to be 3, 4 million, it used to be that they would go back. Now they all stay. And that's because we built the fence. It's counterproductive.
So maybe if we pan out a little, let me try to say that we could see a global process, a couple of global processes taking place, and I welcome your telling me whether this works or not. And I think that this global frame is not how our politicians talk about it. Trump is very easy to pick on in this way, but he's not, in a lot of ways, very different than Ed is talking about Operation Gatekeeper in the 1990s, and this groundswell of, we need more militarization, we need more protection, we need our government to protect us at the border. That's popular politics. Trump is just the furthest articulator of it, and almost mocking him is almost dangerous because it's such a mainstream that nativism has been such a good political currency in this country, always, but particularly since the 1990s. So it's framed, and to respond to your question of media, everything is framed in terms of national security, and the thing that we're not talking about, we've talked about migrants, refugees, we haven't talked about the other figure here, the terrorist, right? So we're, since 9/11, the Immigration and Naturalization Service has been put into the Department of Homeland Security, right? So when the INS moves, as an immigration historian, I'm always interested when it goes from the Department of Labor to the Department of Justice in the 1940, that's enforcement. When it goes from the Department of Justice into Homeland Security, that means that immigration is lumped with securitization, right? And so that's how it's figured in political debates. But if we pan out a little, I think what we're seeing is a global process where capital and corporations are increasingly unimpeded by regulation. So free trade, NAFTA, Central American Free Trade Act, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, says to big companies, Nike, Exxon, Mobil, don't worry about local regulations, labor unions, environmental rights. You guys need to develop, and your money will trickle down. This economic theory discredited under Herbert Hoover, but whatever. But these people, if we give them freedom, they will develop wealth, and wealth will be good for all of us. The corresponding freedoms are not granted to us as individuals, and they are not granted to the people who are most impacted, the farmers of Mexico, indigenous people in this hemisphere. And I think, and Louise, this is where I think my theory is weak, but maybe can work a little bit. I think that this is part, what we see is continual U.S. engagements in wars over oil in the Middle East, continual destabilization of societies and regimes, and oil is part of the project here, right? So national securitization, discourses of nativism, more and more securitization in the name of anti-terror, and then globally, corporations get to move and do whatever they need to do, and we have less and less power to say, well, gee, even undocumented workers should have some basic rights at work. We're talking about the right that if a giant beam falls on you and crushes your leg, the company pays for your health. That is very difficult now, right? Because there are some basic skeletal rights, but what's happened, and I think you've been involved in these cases as well, that is when a worker tries to press them, the employer says, well, you're undocumented, so I'm going to call the Homeland Security right now. So the rights of workers, environmental rights, I talked about Berta Cáceres as trying to preserve indigenous ways of life, but I didn't note that we all need water. And one of the things that's happening with what scholars call neoliberalization, this global process, is that resources that we think of as the commons, and that I think a faith tradition supports, that water, air, land, clean place for the kids to play, those are human rights. Those are being privatized, and people have less and less access to those very basic rights. I just taught a movie, I always have to talk about this, that I really commend to you. It's sci-fi, which I don't usually go there. It's called Sleep Dealer. And it imagines a future in which the labor problem has been solved. They've built a really solid wall, and they have cyber braceros in Mexico working for the US. Anyway, I recommend it to you, because it explains all of this, but
Well, the Middle East is very complicated. I don't want to reduce it to simple things, but I think I have to bring up Islamophobia now, because a key tenet of Islamophobia is that it's all about Islam, and you don't need to know anything else, which means there's no history, there's no cause, there's no effect, right? It means you don't have to ask any questions. So you hear certain political candidates now saying, I don't know why this is happening. Well, my God, read, right? So there is a history, and Syria is different than Iraq, is different than Afghanistan, is different than Yemen. So it's hard to do all that, but in terms of our responsibility, well, you probably know that Ronald Reagan created the Taliban, right? I mean, and Mahmoud Mamdani, a Columbia anthropologist, wrote a book on this and said, never since the 7th century had this vision of an army fighting in the name of Islam been materialized until the Reagan administration, with the help of the Bin Laden family, decided to create it to fight against communism, right? So that's the source of the Taliban, not Islam. The Israeli government created Hamas because as a opposing force to the PLO, right? That's been documented. That happened about 20 years ago. Again, it wasn't about Islam. And I've already mentioned that ISIS is really the product of former prisoners of the US administration in Iraq. So, but it's not that simple, because Saudi Arabia is involved in this, Wahhabism is involved in this, the Saudis are the #1 arms buyers of American weapons, so there we have corporate interests involved in maintaining that relationship with Saudi Arabia no matter what. And of course the oil in Saudi Arabia. So there are internal factors. Saddam Hussein, excuse me, I got the wrong. Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad. So we went through the father-son. Definitely was a dictator and a repressive leader. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. People led a revolution to overthrow him, just like what happened in Egypt. And now that's not a pleasant story either. And it was a bit chaotic there, and the Saudis got involved, and Qatar got involved, and they just threw money at groups, and they didn't really monitor what was happening, and it's a real mess in Syria. Yemen is being attacked by Saudi Arabia and American drones. Saudi Arabia is launching its proxy war against Iran, who it just doesn't like, because they're Shia. Very silly. but they can't attack Iran, so the cost of being quiet over the U.S. treaty with Iran, the kind of peace we have now, is that Saudi Arabia can do whatever it wants in Yemen. So the Yemeni people are the victim of that conflict, which has, the U.S. is a partner in that, in its ascent and in its drone killings in Yemen. And the Yemenis have nowhere to go. Their only neighbor, they're bound. They have the water on 3 sides, and they have Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia won't let them in. So they just have to sit there and be killed, because the other choices are crossing the Red Sea into Djibouti and Somalia, and you have to go through Qaeda territory. Anyhow, it's really... So I don't know that I've clarified anything there, but it's very complex, and the U.S. government is a key historic partner in these complexities and in a lot of the negative outcomes of them.
Thank you. We were originally, folks, going to take questions in the last half hour, but since we've got a little extra time right here, why don't we open up and see if anybody wants to ask some questions.
Mike? Just a comment going along with how the United States policy has created some of these problems. The gang problem in Central America is a U.S. creation. Marcel Trucha and the 18th Street Gang, both Los Angeles street gangs. I was in El Salvador in 1994 in Santa Tecla when members of Marcel Trucha first started showing up. We knew that because we started seeing gang graffiti in English. What happened was that the United States was unable or unwilling to assimilate Salvador refugees in Los Angeles. Gangs got started for self-protection or for whatever reason. The United States then deported the gangs back to El Salvador. And the result of that is that now essentially El Salvador, Honduras, and to a great extent Guatemala are failed states.
Yeah, I think that IRERA, the immigration law that passes in 1996, makes deportable offenses that somebody who's not naturalized committed. So, like, this is the case that happened a lot to Salvadorans, happens to Cambodians. So you come in, you haven't naturalized for whatever reason, you jack a car at 18. You get in trouble with the cops, you get out of jail. You don't go to jail, but you get in trouble with the cops. You're young. You go on and live a productive life. That becomes retroactively deportable after IRERA. So you have that adds to the gang problem in Central America and in Southeast Asia as well. These people who are then deported who have no knowledge of the language or culture that they're deported to. So who's their social worker? The gangs. The gangs are like, hey, we speak English, and we look familiar to you. They go back to these countries. They have no recognition. So in a way, what Ed's talking about, enhanced deportation, does exactly what you're talking about hemispherically. It creates migration problems in this country, and it creates global problems that trigger more migration.
At this point, is it naive to mention compassion or morality when we're talking about these issues? I mean, quite frankly, it gets to the point, I don't want to bring the room down, but it feels like we are at the point as a culture, as a global culture, where capitalism and corporations have infiltrated everything in a way that almost makes compassion and morality feel like these wonderful, it's like this sort of elegiac, remember when human beings were able to actually feel this way, and actually able to feel this way to a degree where change could happen. That's what it feels sometimes. I think especially just listening, to this degree of infiltration globally, and then thinking about the Supreme Court is on my mind, thinking about Citizens United, and how this is just a microcosm, something like Citizens United, we're seeing it infiltrate our own nation. This is something that's already happened on a global level. So, what to do? And, yeah, What does
We're
this
gonna come to
mean?
what to do later on, too.
Oh,
So I don't
yes,
wanna jump the gun on that too much. But
Yeah.
Well, let me, if I may address that. When I think of the great civil rights movements in the United States, I'm thinking about abolitionism, I'm thinking about suffragism and feminism, I'm thinking about equal rights for African Americans. I think those movements succeeded because the people behind those movements emphasized the commonality of humanity and rejected attempts to say, well, we are different and they are other. They said, no, we're all the same. And so I think with immigrants, that's the message that can win, is to explain to your fellow citizens, these immigrants are not others, they're not a separate class. They are you, and everything that happens to them affects you too. And certainly in the labor movement, right, when you have a source of labor in the US that can be exploited, that can be subjected to wage theft, where they work and then the employer refuses to pay them and says, what are you going to do about it? Or they're injured and they don't have a safe workplace. So when you have a group of exploited labor in the US, all workers suffer because it drags down the wages and treatment and safety of all workers. And if you can let people understand, I mean, that was one of the arguments against slavery, was the free labor argument, that the existence of slave labor undercuts wages for everyone who works for a living. Right? And then that created that commonality. And I think also on education and the future, to be able to say, look, having these uneducated pockets of people, children who were brought here young, who are not citizens, the DACA children, who then cannot get in-state tuition for college, so they can go to high school only because the U.S. Supreme Court decided they can. But they can't take their talents to college, they can't get a higher education. This is an enormous resource of brain power that's being wasted. And these are people who could create companies, create jobs that we are leaving, in minimum wage jobs in hotels and restaurants. And all of us would benefit if these people were given an opportunity to flourish. So I think it's breaking down that idea of otherness and constantly pointing out the connections we have.
I just want to say something about compassion. It is apparently a Western liberal value to take in migrants and refugees, but if you're just going to abuse those people once you take them in, then you're not really enacting a compassion. There's no compassion there, right? And I'm thinking what's growing in the United States, but what is and has been for quite a while in parts of Europe, again, is this anti-Arab, anti-Muslim. They were never welcomed in those countries since they went there post-World War II. They were never treated decently. They faced racism in France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany. I mean, so, don't take them in if you're going to treat them like dogs. And what worries me is now we have people running for office in this country who want to do the very same thing. And the end result is not positive. So either don't take people or love them. That's like, but don't play this game with people. We're the country of refuge, and yet you come here and we're going to abuse you and not pay you well and deny you rights and attack you. And this is what's going on.
If I could just get your reaction and follow-up question. We heard a number of different explanations of what the different drivers are. Destabilization of countries, often as a result of our own foreign policy, domestic policy in terms of building this wall, which, as you say, keeps people in as well as keeps people out. We talked about the rise of the national security state, global corporate capitalism and neoliberalism and the roles they play. See all these big forces at work, and of course the United States is a big player in all these things. My question is this all, and it seems to all be coming back and biting us, is this short-sightedness on our part, or I go back to the original question, who benefits? Is this happening because someone wants it to happen this way, or are we just really haven't been wise enough to see that everything we're doing is blowing up in our faces?
Well, I think Rachel mentioned the great military-industrial complex, which, full confession, when I was a practicing lawyer, my clients were bomb makers and cruise missile makers and carrier-based aircraft makers. So I worked for the military-industrial complex as a lawyer. It's simple, right? You fire a cruise missile to target a leader of ISIS. Once it explodes, the US government needs to buy another one. You know, $10 million cruise missile. So if you manufacture cruise missiles at $10 million a pop, you want them to be used. Because that's a good business model. So there are clearly very strong factors. And one of the things the military-industrial complex does, and this was something I saw that I thought was back in the 80s, I said, wow, this is really smart. You know, they build their manufacturing facilities all over the country in key states, the states of congressmen who sit on the appropriations committee. So they can say, you know, we want that military budget to go up, we want you to buy more of our product, and hey, look, you know, we have a big factory in your district, congressman or congresswoman, and they employ 500 people, and you wouldn't want us to close that factory and throw those people out of work, would you? It's good for jobs, it's good for you. Everyone wins. And those are the voices that are heard in Washington. And you know, you can sort of, I was going to say it may depend on which political party is in power, but the truth is actually it really doesn't. Those are the voices that are heard. They're very well, whether a Democrat wins or a Republican wins, they're going to do just fine, right? They're very well connected. And then in the, you know, the global free trade argument and free trade agreements, and why do they get entered into if they end up being bad for U.S. workers and maybe destabilize people in foreign countries who lose their livelihood. Well, I mean, I would just go back, and Rachel already mentioned this too, so I'm just repeating what she said, but I go back to Theodore Roosevelt, back when he was president at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, and these giant corporations were a new thing. And Roosevelt said in one of his speeches, you know, I look at these new giant corporations, and my only thought is either the United States government is going to control them, or they're going to control the United States government. And for a period of time, more or less, I think the United States government was on the top, and in recent years, I think it's pretty clear that they are on top of the U.S. government, and they're pulling the strings.
And I just like about the global capitalism piece, which, you know, like I've just focused on the wars and the violence, so of course this global capitalism piece is relevant to the Middle East too, but this is what I like to explain to people in a very simple way. I have a couple of young adult Yemenis living with I'm hosting right now. And they eat cheese that's in a can. And they drink milk that's in a can. They buy this stuff. And I look at it, it's all made by Nestle, the cheese and the milk. And I said, you know, it's really not healthy. And we have real cheese here. And we have real milk here. They don't like it. The Yemenis, you know, simple people, poor country, but they had their integrity. They were able to produce the goods that they could afford to eat and feed their families with. Global capitalism has moved in because of debts and loans. The government was forced to take off all subsidies of breads, of fuel, so the cost of living became high. And now instead of, you know, drinking milk that could be produced locally or eating cheese that could be produced locally, these families are buying products imported from I don't even know where, made by Nestle. Just that little simple story shows you how in one little family you become impoverished. And I can't get these kids to stop eating this stuff because it makes them feel like they're in Yemen.
Yeah.
So it's very close to their heart to eat this canned cheese and drink this canned milk. So I can't tell them, who am I to say, well, don't do that because you need to do it my way. But I just see in them how global capitalism creates poverty. And bad nutrition, right? Because all that stuff is full of chemicals and it's not nutritious, and it's shifted their whole diet. It's shifted their whole diet. The life expectancy for males in Yemen right now is 52.
Short question.
Go ahead, or did you want to respond first? Then go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say in response to both of these really beautiful responses that, to quote another U.S. president, something else I don't do that often, you know, when I'm always moved by Dwight Eisenhower's final address where he talked about the military-industrial complex, and this kind of speaks to Shane's question, and talked about the spiritual effects. You don't find presidents talking about that stuff much. So I think Ed outlined really beautifully, both of you outlined really beautifully, sort of what the consequences of corporate, the aggregation of corporate power is. And I think it speaks to Shana's question about mercy, because we can feel so easily like we're powerless. We can feel like, you look at TPP and you think, oh, it is just over. But I think, for example, about the struggles over mining in Wisconsin and the Pinocchio Hills, and when I've been up there, I've seen these signs, and this speaks to the short-sightedness piece, quit whining and start mining, because it provides jobs. So there's a local, political, grassroots labor advocacy to get to dirty the waters of Lake Superior forever for all of us, because it provides jobs short-term. And it would seem, like sometimes I feel like, oh my God, it's not even practical to make this case about clean water and indigenous rights. But you know what, we won that one because of grassroots activism, because people cared, because people, indigenous people and environmentalists, and there was a coalition. So, it really feels overwhelming all the time to me. But it also feels like the little things that everyone in this room, I think, is engaged in doing. They wind up aggregate also making small differences, and those small differences open cracks. And that's what we have, and that's really where we have to work. And so I think fighting the spiritual contamination of all this stuff is really important. And I think the first casualty is hope, really, because you just feel so bad so much of the time, and so like, oh my God, you read the paper and like, Obama is supporting the TPP.
Yeah.
Geez.
Abolitionists were viewed as crazy people. Slavery would never end. They were the radical fringe, and they won. And you just have to be persistent.
Father Jim, we'll take your question, then we're going to take a break.
Okay. I may be wrong, but it seems to me that a lot of a driver for conflict and dislocation, migration, is sort of religious wars and a resurgence of fundamentalism that the Sunnis and the Shias and the Wahhabis and then the Islamist fanatics who want to destroy the lifestyle and the values of the West. And it's not just happening over there. I mean, there's resurgence of battles between more indigenous religions and implants like Christianity of whatever stripe. That there's a lot of this religious war going, almost like the religious wars in Europe hundreds of years ago. And what do we do with that?
The only place I know of a religious war going on is in ISIS-controlled territory of Syria and Iraq. Like, it's not anywhere. I mean, if you're talking about the Middle East, it's not anywhere else. Like, there's no religious war in Lebanon or Jordan or...
The fights between the Sunnis and the Shias?
Where? That's what I'm saying, like, that's a construction.
It is.
Yes,
Okay.
I mean, I'm just like, and ISIS is not about Sunni, I mean, ISIS is a Sunni organization, but they don't like anybody who's not, they kill more Sunnis than they kill anybody, so that's not what you would call an interreligious war. Lebanon is multi-religious, there's no war. Egypt, I mean, you're talking about Saudi and Iranian hostility towards each other, but that's not a war.
Well,
So I think we hear a lot about religious fundamentalism and religious wars, and again, I think this is sort of our label that we put on things. And you mentioned, going back hundreds of years. When our nation was born as an independent country, it wasn't that far removed from the time in Europe where if the king converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, everyone had to become Protestant. And then if the king switched back, right? And England had that whole history. So when we became independent, religious freedom and the government being kept out of promoting any particular religious faith was a very fundamental tenet of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. That served us very well as a nation for a very long time. But what has changed politically in recent years is that politicians began catering to religious denominations in the U.S. to get their support. And I wish I could say that it was only, you know, evangelical, right-wing fringe churches, but it's also the Catholic Church. And politicians began to promote this idea that somehow religious freedom for all is oppressing your faith, because you are somehow, by not, you know, by having to recognize other people's faiths, it is limiting your faith. And that energized different religious faiths, and I think to all our detriment now, faith has become part of the presidential campaign, and you see that. And so we are creating religious fundamentalism for our own purposes, and then we, you know, project it outward to the rest of the world and try and understand. We create it in how we view our own country, and then we project it out to the rest of the world and say, well, we must explain what's going on there too, in my opinion.
Is it possible to follow up?
Anybody else? Quick follow-up, sure.
Is it easier? I mean, I feel like it's easier to sell war ideologically.
Oh, yeah.
If you just say, hey, there's a bunch of oil under Iraq, let's go get it. Maybe there would be a lot of people who were like, yeah, but I think that it probably, there would be more people who were like, I don't feel really comfortable about this. And I think that just all of those, I think that we have to be very careful about those ideological and faith-based concepts that pull us not here in our frontal lobe, but here in our viscera. You know, it's very dangerous.
After World War I, Walter Lippmann, a journalist, wrote a book called Public Opinion. And he was trying to figure out how, you know, we had always been friends with Germany. And then all of a sudden we went to war with Germany, and they were the evil Huns, and they're killing people, and we have to fight Germany. And he said to himself, how does the public opinion get turned around to support a war? And he wrote this book called Public Opinion about how policymakers and politicians send messages and frame narratives that then cause us to view the world in a certain way and maybe change our public opinion and get support for wars. And he wrote it as a book for how do they get support for wars. And that book basically became the Bible for every political campaign ever since. How do you win an election? How do you frame the narrative? How do you motivate people?
Yeah.
And that's, every day I read the newspaper and I think, oh yeah, Walter Lippmann.
I mean, the place, I should say, as I started, the place where there are Sunni-Shia tensions are in Iraq, and that was a situation created by the Bush administrations. I mean, I'm not saying there was some historic, there was an Iran-Iraq war, if you remember, and some Shia Iraqis fought on the side of Iran, so I don't want to disregard that real piece of history, but it was not this Sunni-Shia antipathy that characterized Iraq. It's a piece of the history. The United States program for Iraq really institutionalized Sunni-Shia antipathy, let's say. I just read an interesting article where, you know, somebody wrote, why didn't the U.S. government go into Iraq with the Mandela Plan of reconciliation? It could have done that. Could have done that.
We've got 1 minute for you, Rachel.
I just want to pick up on this, that, you know, the U.S. history in Iran, you know, creates the fundamentalist reaction. So the very first, the CIA kind of practiced, and if you read about this, it's kind of hysterical. The CIA doesn't know how to overthrow a foreign government yet in 1952, so they send these operatives in, and they're walking around like, well, you look kind of shady. We need to overthrow this guy who's, we've heard he's a socialist. And they do overthrow a democratically elected democratic socialist government in Iran. And so when our government, you know, backs the Shah, the oppressive, you know, informs the Sabak, the secret police, then lets the Shah come here for chemotherapy, it precipitates something that then looks to us like, wow, those crazy fundamentalists. You know, the reason the Iranian people supported fundamentalism is they were familiar with what the United States was capable of doing in their country. You know, and it looked for a while in 1979 like the better deal. You know, the person who really could oust the Shah for good was the Ayatollah, right? It was a strategic calculation of the Iranian people's desires not to revisit the CIA taking control of their democratic process. It wasn't a great decision long run, but it wasn't a bunch of religious fundamentalists. It was a bunch of people saying, well, we've got the U.S., we've got the Ayatollah. What's the best chances for emancipation? We've tried the U.S., it hasn't gone so well. What with the Savak running the country for 25 years? So.
And then, you know, we have to recognize there is a growing connection to Islam among Muslims. I mean, that's something real. And I'm not talking about wars, and I'm not talking about violence, I'm talking about religious faith.
Right.
And I've seen this before my eyes, because I've lived in Palestine, I've lived in Jordan, been to Syria many times, whatever. I mean, when I first started doing research or human rights work in those countries, most women did not cover their hair. Most people did not pray. Most people did not fast, or maybe fasting in Ramadan was kind of the one thing that stuck through. And you slowly see this process of women beginning to cover their hair, people beginning to pray. That's their religion. That's their religious faith. I mean, they had become so westernized because of Western power and intervention in the area that they en masse disbanded their own religion. And, you know, it was very comfortable for people like me because, oh, they look like me, they act like me, they dress like me, right? I mean, I gotta acknowledge that. And as this change was happening before my eyes, I was like, I don't know about this. But it's like, wait a minute, that's their religious faith. Those are their religious beliefs. They're simply reconnecting to their own faith. That's a real process, but that doesn't have anything to do with violence or war or anything that it's being falsely connected to. Like, those are different processes.